Let me tell you a story. The year is 1933. The German economy is in a shambles. The war has left the country battered. The Treaty of Versailles has forced Berlin to pay war reparations. How much? 132 billion gold marks. That's some 31.4 billion US dollars. Germany is in debt. Germans are demoralized. There is social unrest. 2 successive rounds of elections have failed to restore stability. There is post-war hyperinflation. There's unemployment. There's uncertainty. Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party decide to exploit this crisis. On the 30th of January, Hitler is sworn into power. He is the new leader of Germany. The rest, they say, is history. Moral of the story: financial distress and inflation have the power to change the course of history. And throughout this week, we told you what's happening around the world, how stocks are falling, how currencies are losing value, fuel is becoming more valuable, prices of basic commodities are going up. Tonight, we'll tell you what an inflation means, not for your purchasing power or the money in your bank, but for the world we live in. What does inflation mean for the world order? Hello and welcome to Gravitas Plus. I'm Palki Sharma, and this is our world. A conglomeration of democracies, authoritarian regimes, and constitutional monarchies. Will it remain this way post-inflation? Today, our world is interconnected, it's close. There is free flow of trade. Will it remain this way after the financial crisis? You see, inflation affects politics, policies, global priorities, and poverty. And we'll talk about all 4, starting with the first P, politics. Inflation is often called the mother of political change. I told you what happened in post-war Germany. Well, Europe is at war again. This war has contributed to inflation. There are protests the world over, and protesters can be unforgiving at polling booths. Ask former US President Jimmy Carter. When he was in office, oil and food prices had shot up. Unemployment had jumped. Inflation brought Carter down. He lost re-election to Ronald Reagan. Today, food prices in the US are up 10%. Fuel prices are up 8%. Come November, President Joe Biden faces midterm elections. Chances are inflation may seal this election. It could well change the course of American politics. In India, leaders know the link between inflation and elections. In 2014, when the Manmohan Singh government lost the parliamentary polls, inflation was said to be among the big reasons. Now that you understand what inflation can do to governments, consider this. Currently, global inflation is over 7%. Food prices have gone up at least 7%. About 50 countries go to polls this year and the next. This includes Brazil, Israel, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Turkey. If prices continue to rise, these leaders may find themselves out of office, because rising prices can topple governments. They can also change the fate of a country. Look at Venezuela. It has the largest oil reserves in the world, but where is it on the global map? It's in the throes of a political crisis and inflation. In fact, hyperinflation. Between 1973 and 2022, prices in Venezuela have gone up 3,729%. 3,729%. Let that sink in. And now allow me to also tell you this, that this is not the worst number. In February 2019, inflation in Venezuela had reached, wait for it, 344,509%. 3,44,509%. By then, the Venezuelan currency was junk. They said using cash as toilet paper was more prudent than buying a roll. What happened then? More than 6 million Venezuelans left home. That's nearly 20% of the country's population. And what was once the richest country in Latin America is now struggling to stay relevant. No country wants to meet that fate. No country wants to be wiped out by inflation. So what do? We come to the next P, policies. Countries change their policies, or should I say inflation forces countries to change policies. Let's pull out a chart. These countries have banned the export of certain food items since the start of the Ukraine war. Argentina has banned the export of soybean oil and meal. Algeria, pasta, wheat derivatives, vegetable oil and sugar. Egypt, vegetable oil, maize, wheat, flour, oils, lentils, pasta, beans. Indonesia, palm oil and palm kernel oil. Serbia, wheat, corn, flour, oil. Kosovo, wheat, corn, flour, vegetable oil. India, wheat. The war has increased the prices of all these commodities, so for governments worldwide, the priority now is to control prices at home to ensure food security, because hungry voters can be unforgiving and no government wants to risk their wrath. So come inflation, trade policies invariably become more nationalistic, protectionist. The domestic market gets priority. Sometimes diplomacy takes a backseat. Speaking of which, inflation also tends to force a shift in diplomacy. Let's consider Europe. Inflation in the Eurozone has touched a record high. What's the Eurozone? It's a monetary union of 19 EU states. All of these have euro as their primary currency, also as their sole legal tender. Currently, inflation in the Eurozone is at its highest since the creation of the euro. When was that? The year 1999, meaning inflation has touched a 3-decade high, courtesy this war. A survey published in June asked Europeans across 10 countries what they thought of the war in Ukraine. More than a third said they wanted it to be over as soon as possible, even if that meant Ukraine conceding land. This war has affected the day-to-day lives of Europeans. More than 40% of European gas comes from Russia, so does 26% of their oil. Sanctions against Russia and bans on Russian imports have hit Europeans. Come winter, they will need to heat their homes. And not everyone will be able to afford a sky-high energy bill. The war has made meals expensive. In Italy, pasta prices are up 40%. So it's not surprising that Europeans are almost equally split when it comes to the war. Some say they want peace, even if it comes at the cost of concessions. Others say they want justice. At the recent NATO and G7 summits, European leaders pledged to support Ukraine at any cost. But not every voter is ready to bear this cost. Pollsters say the survey will affect European policy sooner rather than later. Europe could have to rethink its priorities. Which brings us to the third P, priorities. Inflation forces a shift in not only national priorities, but also global priorities. Climate change, for example, making climate action a global priority was not easy. It took a lot of climate cops to convince the world to go green. Inflation has reversed this. Let me show you some headlines. Coal goes big as inflation hits energy sector. Europe may shift back to coal. Austria reopens coal-fired stations despite climate goals. Experts warn of climate risks. US makes a U-turn on green promises. Do you get the story? When inflation hits energy, when petrol, diesel and gas become expensive, countries lean on cheaper energy sources like coal, even if that means polluting the earth and accelerating climate change. Never thought inflation could change so much, did you? Well, that's the thing. We tend to limit the definition of inflation to a change in purchasing power. While price rise is definitely the fundamental meaning of inflation, also the first fallout, inflation changes more than the money in your bank. And that's the point we're trying to make. So let's wrap with the final P, poverty. 1.1 billion people around the world cannot afford essentials like food. They live below the poverty line. With the rise in prices, more people are pushed into poverty. It has its own set of social problems like malnutrition, miscarriage, infant mortality, crime, joblessness. Inflation sets off a chain reaction, one that takes years to stop. So that's Inflation 101.